Hi all. Welcome to the virtual Azure Community Day. I'm excited to get to speak to you, albeit from afar. This is the part where I tell you I'm definitely going to post the slides on my site tonight. You'll be able to grab the code there too. You're going to check tonight, tomorrow, next week, next month. In about 3 months, you'll get tired of checking and you'll email me. And in 6 months, I'll reply right away and tell you, no, I'm definitely going to post it on my site tonight. I don't like that process at all, which is why you can go to robrich.org right now and you can go get the code. Let's go there. So here's robrich.org. We're going to look at building debug Kubernetes with Azure Dev Spaces. Here's the slides right here that we're going to look at. Here's the code. You can get all of that right now by going to robrich.org and clicking on presentations. While you're there, let's click on About Me and take a look at some of the things that I've done recently. I'm a Microsoft MVP, a friend of Redgate. AZ GiveCamp brings volunteer developers together with charities who otherwise couldn't afford software services. We start building software for them Friday after work. Sunday afternoon, we deliver that completed software back to the charities. Sleep is optional, caffeine provided. If you're in Phoenix, come join us for the next AZ GiveCamp. Or if you'd like a GiveCamp in your area, reach out to me by email or by Twitter, and let's get philanthropy installed in your area as well. Some of the other things that I've done, I worked on SQL source control basics. I worked on the Gulp project as a core contributor in version 2 and version 3. One of the things I'm particularly proud of is I replied to a .NET Rocks podcast episode. They read my comment on the air, and they sent me a mug. Woohoo! So there's my claim to fame. So let's dig into debugging Kubernetes with Azure Dev Spaces. We talked about this guy. Let's take a look at Azure Dev Spaces. Azure Dev Spaces allows us to debug containers in context. Let's take a look at that. So let's take a look at Azure Dev Spaces. Here's a site that I have running in AKS. Let's push refresh. And we see that we hit a breakpoint inside Visual Studio. Inside Visual Studio, I can take a look around. I've got all my normal variables. I can do all the things that I do in Visual Studio. But is this now running inside AKS? Or is it running locally? And that's part of the beauty of Azure Dev Spaces. Let's push stop here in Visual Studio and take a look at what we did to build this. So Azure Dev Spaces, it's a way to debug a microservice without setting up the rest of the services. So I can debug in context. And what's really cool is I can debug in context using any language, any framework, any Kubernetes service. The only requirement is that I'm debugging from Visual Studio or from VS Code. And once I'm inside AKS and inside Visual Studio or VS Code, then I can debug anything. So the sample application that Microsoft builds is this bike sharing app. And this example is really interesting. It has lots of services here in the samples. And all of these services are lots of different languages. And there's a whole lot going on. It's a really cool sample. But in this case, I'm going to step back and kind of build my own sample. I wanted to build a sample so that I could get a look at what are all of the pieces and how they interact, and also create a sample that is, hopefully a little bit easier to look at. Here's that methodology of Azure Dev Spaces that we see inside this sample. So I'm going to take that service in the middle, and I'm going to pull it out of the cluster, and I'm going to forward all the traffic to my local machine. Now I'm forwarding the traffic to that service into my local machine so that I can debug outside of a container in regular context. But then I've also forwarded all of the other responsibilities that I need to be able to get the rest of the application back into Azure Kubernetes Service. And it's that magic. It's automatically proxying all of the content that I need back into my local machine, and then pushing the rest of that into Azure Kubernetes Service that allows me to do this debugging Kubernetes in a really, really elegant way. So how it works. It replaces a pod in AKS with an agent that will forward traffic to my local machine. What it'll also do is forward in any environment variables and other configuration details to my local machine so that as I start up my application, I have that exact same configuration. it updates my host file so that I can then call into all the other services to do what I need to do. It'll port forward those services from my local machine off to Azure Kubernetes service so that I can get that seamless experience of debugging like I would debug all of the other pieces, but I'm debugging it on my local machine using my standard Visual Studio or VS Code setup. So the setup, arguably the boring part, but it's important. Step one, I need to do that cluster setup. It's just a normal AKS cluster. There isn't anything special about this AKS cluster. I don't need to turn on anything interesting. It's just a cluster. And I deploy all my normal services and pods to that cluster. So in this case, I have all of that content in AKS. And when my debugger isn't there, I can just push start and I'll get at the content inside Kubernetes. Next up, my dev setup. It's different for Visual Studio and VS Code, and the docs for this are really detailed in the specific steps for each platform. If I'm looking at Visual Studio, I need the Azure CLI. I need Visual Studio 2009 16.7 Preview 4 or greater, and I need the Azure development workload inside Visual Studio. I'll also need the local process for Kubernetes extension. Once I have all of these pieces installed, that's just one time, and then now it's ready to go. By extension, if I'm doing this in VS Code, I grab the Azure CLI, the same CLI, the Visual Studio Code on Mac or Windows, and the local process for Kubernetes extension inside VS Code. Again, just a one-time setup, and now I have all of the tools in place to be able to debug this process inside of Kubernetes. Now the cool part, as you grab these slides from robrich.org, all of these blue links are things that you can click through. So you can go grab the steps that you need for Visual Studio and get to the actual docs here on how to set up Visual Studio. And it'll walk you through all of the pieces. Same thing with VS Code. You can go into VS Code and get all of the particulars of what you need to do to set up Azure Dev Spaces with Visual Studio Code. So once we've got it ready to go, let's debug. And we just did that. We went into this box and we clicked local process with Kubernetes, and we just started debugging as if it was a normal thing. Now, the first time we do it, it will prompt us to say, what is your subscription? What is your cluster? What's the namespace in the cluster? What's the service that you're replacing? And then what's the app on your local machine that you're going to run to do this? Also, how you'd like to browse to that service. So that setup gets us to the point where we're debugging things. Setup is done. Let's code. So here's this sample. I wanted to build a sample that was a little bit simpler, didn't have quite as many moving parts. And so this sample, it's available right here at github.com/robrich/debug Kubernetes Dev Spaces. It's up there right now, and you can poke around in it and do all kinds of interesting things. Now in this sample, we have 3 tiers. Here's our front end tier. It's a C# application. A middle tier, and this one's responsible for building PDFs, and a back end that has reports. So many of the pages we'll just use on our front end, and it'll just navigate just fine. But those things where we want to render a PDF, we'll call into the PDF maker, passing in the URL of the report that we want to run. The PDF maker will use Google Chrome in headless mode and Puppeteer to be able to call into the backend, get that HTML, produce that PDF, and render it back on the front end. So we get to kind of debug each of these things, and we get to poke at it in a really interesting way. So let's set up and debug a .NET Core example inside Visual Studio. Here's that sample code. We have the front end. This is a C# app. And the standard controller, here's the home controller. And that home controller just has the pieces that it needs to go call off into the middle tier. So it's going to go call the middle tier URL. And that middle tier URL is here in the front end, in the app settings. It's just middle tier. And so as it calls into the middle tier is that piece that will go do the the node rendering. So here in our routes, we'll look at index.js. And index.js will just take in the URL that we're looking to render, and then it'll send it off to this shoot method. Shoot is a method that I created here in the lib folder, and this shoot method uses Puppeteer, headless Chrome, to go browse to that page together with this backend URL. It'll browse to that page, it'll save a PDF of that page, and it'll return that PDF. So as we're calling the backend is also a C# app. Here's that C# app, and we just have a home controller with various reports. So a regular report, here's a report, here's warnings, and those are just normal views inside of ASP.NET. So here's our warnings. Try new Floraflor. Thank you to Jeff Foxworthy for this. And so here's that HTML page that we just want to render as a report. So if we're here in Azure Dev Spaces, if I go to Home or I go to About, I'm just browsing the front end. But if I go to Report or Warnings, this one will go to the middle tier. The middle tier is going to spin up that PDF engine. It's going to render that page on the back end. And here's that PDF that it returned back to the browser. Now this is great. We didn't have to use any paid PDF images, and that was that perfect use case for having these as separate tiers. If I want to grab this report, I can click through the report. It will go to the middle tier, render that report on the back end, save it as a PDF, and return it. So here's our TPS report. So how do we spin this up? Well, let's look at Visual Studio. We're here inside Visual Studio 2019 preview. And so now we'll just come in here in our properties. We went in and previously picked the AKS cluster, the namespace, the service. These are the service that we want to replace. And ultimately it'll launch this front end profile, which is just another one of these. Here's that front end profile that'll run it on port 5000. So let's push go and start it up. We're connecting to the service. We're hitting the Azure Kubernetes service and understanding the details. It may prompt for admin to be able to grab the details and write the host file entries, grab the configuration details, launch that proxy inside of Azure Kubernetes service. And when we're ready, it will spin up this application. Here's that application. It's just a regular .NET Core 3.1 app. And now when we hit our space inside of Azure Kubernetes service, we can get to that breakpoint. Here's that breakpoint. Now in this case, I'm just going to go. Let's go to the report and see if we get details here. Well, this goes to report, and that URL is just report/pathinfo. The pathinfo has the detail of where we want to go. So now we can step through it and we can say, okay, let's serialize this body. Here's that middle tier URL that we're going to go look for. Let's push go and go do that request. So now we've hit the middle tier. We came back from the back end, and here's our response. Did we get an okay? Yep, we got an okay. And we can go through and examine all of the other details. When we're done, we push go, and we've got our report. So that was all of the pieces of debugging inside of Visual Studio. Here in the sample, we also have the particulars for how to launch this inside of various places. So to get started, that first step was to launch it inside of Azure Kubernetes Service. I have a Docker Compose file if you want to take a check on this locally. But ultimately, the magic happens when we load up these Kubernetes YAML files. So in the backend, we have the YAML files for starting the deployment, starting the service, similar things for the middle tier. And in the front end, we have not only that deployment and that service, but also an ingress controller that leverages HTTP application routing so that we're able to get at that application by URL. So we're able to debug a .NET Core app inside Visual Studio, and we got to see that front-end application. It called off into the middle tier, and ultimately called off into the back end. We're no longer, oh, let's stop debugging. Now that we're not debugging, it launches all the processes to put all of that back. So in a minute, we can come back and load this application again. And the first time, I usually get a 502 bad gateway as it's swapping all of the pieces. But we'll hit it again. And now we have our regular application back in Azure Kubernetes service doing all of the things. Hit the middle tier, hit the back end, and render our report again. So that's really cool. That's how we debug in Visual Studio. Let's also look at debugging inside of VS Code. So here inside VS Code, I've got the extension running. I've got my middle tier app going. And this middle tier just says node app. That's what I want to do to start up. That's how I would debug locally. If I was using the Docker Compose file, that's exactly how it would launch. Here in my launch.json, I have not only my regular node launch if I wanted to debug this entire app locally, but I also have this other task of how to get started with Kubernetes service. Now I went in here, Control-Shift-P, and I said local process with Kubernetes, configure local process with Kubernetes, and it interviewed me to ask me details about what is my Azure Kubernetes cluster, what dev space, what service will I replace, and ultimately the results of that are here in task.json. Task.json identifies that in this case I'm replacing the middle tier, and I'm going to forward to port 3000 locally to be able to do all of the content on my server. So here in launch.json, that's the process that I'll debug. Let's step in here and let's say debug with K8s. I'm going to fire this up. And it's doing all the things, which is really cool. It's going to connect to that cluster that is in the default namespace. Ooh, we need to launch the administrator prompt to do some additional actions. Here's the process where it's going to write my host file to ensure that my host file keeps up with all of the things and forwards data correctly across all the things. Now there is a really cool thing right here. Here's a temp file that has all of those environment variables. If we wanted to launch that file, that would set all the environment variables on a terminal as well so that we can continue on. It's going to replace the middle tier service. It will forward to port 3000 on our local machine. I love this process of getting it started. Go, 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 go. This is so cool, stepping into the middle tier service from VS Code. Writing the host file, forwarding all the environment variables that I need, and ultimately, here in the middle tier as well, when I'm reaching out to that backend tier, I'm just going to reach out to it by name in a similar way. From the front tier, I just called HTTP middle tier. From the middle tier, because that's how my Kubernetes file is set up, I'm just going to call HTTP backend. Now that we've got it running, is it launched yet? Redirecting. Let's take a look at the host file. Did it rewrite the host file? Yes. So here's all of the host file entries that it added so that I can port forward all of the content from my machine into all of the places inside of my application. Let's come here to our app and refresh. This page is just running on Azure Kubernetes service. I don't need to do anything special to get into my middle tier, but let's run the report, see if the report will forward. Ooh, it's still proxying. Is it launched? Preparing to run. Preparing to run. Go, 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 go. So I just said yes to the admin prompt that allowed me to patch all the things just to make sure everything was good. There we go. Here's the new file. We're debugging. Let's go hit that report page inside of AKS. Here's the AKS. I'm going to hit the report, and it looks like we're already there. Ooh, we started up. It's running on port 3000, the way we would expect it to run locally. This isn't running in a container. It's just doing all the normal things. Let's go hit that report. And we're back debugging inside of Visual Studio Code. Here's the URL that we're looking for. We're looking for /report. Pardon me. So we're going to step into the shoot thing. Shoot is going to go grab the backend URL that's just HTTP backend. And we specifically sanitize the URL to make sure that the first character is a /. Now we're going to go fire up Puppeteer and go grab that PDF. This is going to go call off into the backend, doing all the things that the backend does. The backend is still only running in Azure Kubernetes service. Once the backend finishes rendering, we now have this path to this PDF on the local machine, and let's just send that back to the client. Let's push go, and here on my front end, that's still running in Kubernetes in AKS as well. Now we have our result. That was easy. We were able to debug inside of AKS and having that forward to our local machine to do all the things inside VS Code. So now once again, it may take a minute to unproxy that. Let's hit the report. And we've got all of this running back again inside of AKS. So that was really cool. As it hooks up, it forwards that traffic in. So it creates that agent up in AKS to proxy the traffic from the service that I was coming from into my local machine. And once inside my local machine, I'm just debugging the way I always did. It also does a kubectl port forward to get all of the content to the cluster IP services. So that's how I was able to forward from front end to middle tier when middle tier was running in AKS, and when debugging middle tier, how I was able to get to backend where backend was running inside of AKS. It also updates the host file, gives me that batch script to be able to do similar things, grab those environment variables, and ultimately it will inject those secrets and environment variables into my application that the pod had running inside of Kubernetes. When I push stop, all of that goes away, and my pod slides straight back up into AKS. So ultimately what we do, we just push play, and all of that content works exactly the way that we would expect. We don't need to mess with the containers as we start this up. We're just going to look at that one container, and we're going to yank that off into our own machine, and it proxies the content in, proxies the configuration details that we need to get going, and proxies kubectl proxy port forward to be able to get at all the rest of the services running inside of AKS. Whether this is the front end service or a service in the middle of the stream, it's running on my local machine, not running inside of AKS. When I'm done, that slides back up into place and all of the things are running in AKS, and it just works. So that was great. We got a chance to look at Azure Kubernetes Service and at local debugging with Kubernetes using Azure Dev Spaces. Grab me on Twitter at rob_rich or send me an email. You can grab these slides right now at robrich.org. Thanks for coming to Azure Community Day.